Chuck Norris leaves the casino with a big win, but the guards are already waiting for him at the exit. They expect to take his money easily, but after a few seconds they realize they made a mistake. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. Las Vegas shimmered in the night, its skyline pulsating with neon lights and the rhythmic hum of excitement. The boulevard was alive with tourists, high rollers, and hopeful gamblers chasing fortune. It was a city built on illusion, where money flowed like water and luck determined fates. Amidst this orchestrated chaos, a man stepped out of a black sedan and onto the glistening pavement in front of Imperium Casino. Unlike most who entered, he wasn't here for the spectacle or the indulgence. He was here simply to enjoy a game of skill, free from deception, free from manipulation. At least, that's what he believed. Chuck Norris adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, surveying the grand entrance of the casino. It wasn't the largest in Vegas, nor the most famous, but it had a reputation for exclusivity and high-stakes games. A place where the rich came to gamble fortunes and where the house always had the upper hand. The entrance was framed by towering columns, gold inlay shimmering under the artificial glow of chandeliers. A line of patrons filtered in, some eager, some hesitant, all dreaming of defying the odds. 2 security guards flanked the revolving doors, scanning each guest with practiced scrutiny. Chuck walked past them without a glance, feeling the weight of their gaze follow him inside. The casino floor stretched before him, a labyrinth of roulette wheels, poker tables, and slot machines blinking hypnotically. Servers weaved through the crowd, balancing silver trays adorned with drinks. The air carried a blend of expensive cologne, alcohol, and the unmistakable scent of desperation. At a glance, everything seemed normal, but Chuck's trained instincts noticed the details others missed. The way security subtly monitored certain tables, the exchange of silent nods between pit bosses and dealers, the fleeting moments where luck seemed too conveniently aligned with the house's favor. He wasn't here to expose corruption. He wasn't here to challenge the system. He only wanted to test his skill at blackjack, a game where probability and discipline could tip the balance against chance. Chuck made his way to one of the high-stakes tables, where a handful of well-dressed players sat in stoic anticipation. A young dealer, barely in his mid-20s, shuffled the deck with practiced ease. The pit boss stood a few feet away, his presence subtle yet deliberate, ensuring everything proceeded in accordance with the casino's unwritten rules. Chuck took an empty seat, placing a modest stack of chips before him. The other players barely acknowledged him, too focused on their own calculations. The dealer nodded, his expression neutral as he began the next round. The first few hands were simple. Chuck played conservatively, betting small amounts blending in. He observed the habits of the table, the slight nervous tics of the businessman to his left, the confident but reckless moves of the tourist beside him, the way the dealer's hands hesitated just a fraction of a second when dealing face cards. He wasn't counting cards, but he was reading the flow of the game. Then the tide began to turn. Chuck started increasing his bets at the right moments, capitalizing on patterns, making the strategic plays that maximized his winnings without drawing too much attention. His stack of chips grew steadily. He remained calm, his expression unreadable. Other players lost hands they shouldn't have, while he continued to pull ahead. A shift occurred. The dealer's smile became tighter. The pit boss, who had been casually overseeing multiple tables, now lingered behind him, watching closely. The tension around the table thickened, but Chuck remained composed. He knew what was happening. The house didn't like when someone won too much, too consistently. The dealer shuffled the deck more frequently now, a subtle attempt to disrupt his rhythm. The air felt charged with silent warnings. Chuck ignored them. He played his game, and he played it well. His chip count had nearly tripled from his starting amount. That's when the first intervention came. A man in a tailored navy blue suit approached, exuding the calculated charisma of someone used to diffusing situations without raising alarm. He was the floor manager, someone with enough authority to act, but not enough to make final decisions. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly, his smile as polished as his cufflinks. "I see you've been having quite the lucky streak." Chuck simply nodded, resting his hands on the table. "We always like to take care of our valued guests," the manager continued. "Perhaps you'd like to take a break. Enjoy a complimentary meal at our finest restaurant, on the house, of course." It was a kind offer, but Chuck understood the subtext. They wanted him off the table. They wanted to break his momentum. "No, thanks," he said, his voice steady. A flicker of something unreadable passed over the manager's face. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course. Let us know if you need anything." He stepped away, but Chuck knew the game had changed. The pit boss remained where he was, and Chuck noticed 2 additional security guards now stationed near the entrance of the high-stakes area. They weren't making it obvious, but he knew they were watching. He played a few more hands, deliberately slowing down. He wasn't here to start trouble, but he wasn't about to let intimidation dictate his choices. After one final round, where he doubled his initial stack once again, Chuck decided it was enough. He gathered his chips, standing up from the table. The pit boss shifted slightly, subtly signaling the guards. The air had changed. Chuck made his way toward the cashier's cage, aware that he was no longer just a gambler collecting his winnings. He had become a problem that needed to be managed. At the counter, the woman behind the glass hesitated ever so slightly when he placed his chips down. She glanced towards the security station before beginning the exchange. The delay was minor but deliberate. Moments later, Chuck held his winnings in crisp banknotes, tucking them into the inside pocket of his jacket. He turned toward the exit, walking at an unhurried pace. The guards near the entrance moved slightly as he approached, not enough to block him, but enough to send a message. Chuck kept walking. The doors parted as he stepped out onto the cool Vegas sidewalk. The night air felt different, charged with a sense of impending confrontation. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them. 3 men in dark suits stepping away from a nearby pillar, their focus locked on him. Another 2 appeared near the valet stand. A classic maneuver: spread out, limit the escape routes, close in slowly. Chuck exhaled softly, rolling his shoulders. It seemed Imperium Casino wasn't ready to let him leave with his winnings after all. The night air carried a dry heat, but there was a sharp chill beneath the neon glow of the Imperium Casino. Chuck Norris stepped onto the sidewalk, his movements unhurried, his senses attuned to every shift in the atmosphere. The bright lights and pulsing sounds of the city should have drowned out any tension, but he felt it creeping in like a slow-moving shadow. The weight of his winnings sat comfortably inside his jacket, but the weight of the eyes on him was heavier. He didn't look back immediately. He didn't need to. The presence of the men who had stepped away from the pillar, the calculated movements of the ones by the valet stand, it was enough to confirm what he already knew. The casino wasn't just watching him leave, it was making sure he didn't. As he walked, he took in the street ahead. The usual crowd of tourists and gamblers bustled about, moving between casinos, bars, and neon-lit attractions. It was the kind of chaos that could make a man disappear in plain sight. But Chuck knew that wasn't what these men had in mind. They weren't here to trail him discreetly. They weren't waiting for him to slip away into the crowd. They were closing in, and they wanted him to know it. He slowed his steps just enough to force their hand. The movement of the men behind him adjusted in response, a subtle but telling sign. They were calculating their approach, waiting for the right moment, ensuring that whatever happened next wouldn't disrupt the carefully controlled illusion of the casino's power. That was the nature of a place like Imperium. Nothing happened unless they allowed it. As he reached the curb, Chuck finally turned his head slightly, just enough to confirm what his instincts had already told him. 5 men. Suits tailored but practical, the kind that allowed for movement. Their expressions carefully neutral, but their postures betrayed their readiness. Not casino security, at least not the kind meant for handling unruly patrons. These were enforcers, men who operated in the margins of legality, carrying out the kind of business that didn't make it into the official ledgers. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with slicked-back hair, stepped forward just enough to signal his authority. The others adjusted their spacing, ensuring that Chuck had nowhere to go without passing through them. A silent message. Chuck didn't stop. He continued forward, and the man took the final step to intercept him. "Mr. Norris," the man said smoothly, his voice calm, professional, the kind that had delivered many ultimatums before. "We need a word." Chuck kept walking. The man adjusted, moving directly into his path, forcing the moment of confrontation. The others followed suit, subtly tightening their formation. "Just a moment of your time," the man insisted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We have a concern about your winnings tonight. A misunderstanding, I'm sure, but one that needs to be addressed before you leave." Chuck stopped. His gaze met the man's, reading the weight behind his words. "It would be easier if you came with us," the man continued. "Discreetly." Chuck didn't move. The crowd around them carried on, oblivious, lost in the haze of flashing lights and the thrill of Vegas. But in this small pocket of space, the air was thick with unspoken consequences. The man held his ground for a long second, then inclined his head toward a side alley. "This way." Chuck exhaled through his nose, then, without warning, stepped past the man. He didn't engage, didn't acknowledge the demand. He just moved. For a split second, the men hesitated. The man in charge frowned, the smoothness in his demeanor fracturing just slightly. That hesitation was all Chuck needed. The moment the closest man reached out to grab his arm, Chuck moved. A subtle shift of weight, a rotation of the wrist, and the man's grasp missed entirely. Before the man could react, Chuck's elbow connected with his sternum, a precise and measured strike that sent him stumbling back. The others reacted instantly, their professional composure snapping into action. The nearest lunged forward, attempting to grapple him. Chuck pivoted, using the momentum against him, sending the man sprawling into another. The leader of the group recovered, his expression darkening, and he gave a sharp nod. That was the moment it changed. The moment the casual, businesslike approach dropped and the real intent surfaced. No more words, just action. The first punch came fast, trained, efficient, aimed to subdue rather than harm. Chuck dodged, letting it slide past his shoulder before answering with a strike of his own. His fist connected with the attacker's ribs, forcing an exhale of air, but there was no time to slow down. The next man was already on him. A sharp jab came toward his face. Chuck tilted just enough to evade, then countered with a palm strike to the chin. The man's head snapped back, his balance faltering. Chuck shifted his footing, positioning himself so that the alley's brick wall was at his back, preventing them from fully surrounding him. Two more advanced together. One went low, aiming to take out his legs, while the other aimed high, looking for an opening at his head or torso. They were trained, coordinated. Not brawlers, not thugs. But they weren't him. Chuck sidestepped the low attempt, his knee rising to meet the man's face as he passed. The impact was solid, a muffled crunch that sent him crumpling to the ground. The second attacker swung wide, a heavy strike that might have had power if it had connected. Chuck caught his wrist, twisting with controlled force, sending the man to his knees. The leader of the group was the last to act, watching as his men struggled to regain control. He reached into his jacket, but Chuck was already moving. A kick to the wrist sent whatever weapon he had intended to draw flying. The man barely had time to react before Chuck closed the distance, a final, precise strike, sending him collapsing into the alley wall. Silence. The only sounds left were the distant hum of traffic and the shallow breaths of the men at his feet. Chuck adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of his winnings still secured inside. He turned, stepping over the nearest body, and walked back toward the open street. The city carried on around him, unaware, as if nothing had happened. As if the Imperium Casino hadn't just sent 5 men to ensure he didn't leave with what he rightfully won. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message had been sent, but he knew this wasn't over. The neon glow of Las Vegas reflected off the slick pavement as Chuck Norris walked down the bustling sidewalk, moving away from the Imperium Casino. The noise of the city surrounded him, laughter, car horns, the rhythmic hum of slot machines spilling from open doors. To any casual observer, he was just another gambler leaving a casino, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his stride unhurried. But Chuck knew better. He could still feel the weight of the casino's influence pressing down on him, even out here in the open. The men he had left in the alley weren't the type to simply lick their wounds and walk away. Imperium had invested too much in controlling its domain. They wouldn't tolerate a challenge, especially not one as public as this. His instincts told him he wasn't alone. It wasn't just paranoia. He had spent too many years honing his awareness to mistake a real threat for a false alarm. The air carried a tension that hadn't been there before, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the night. He had seen the casino's reach in action, felt its hands trying to close around him. They wouldn't let him go so easily. He turned a corner, stepping into a quieter stretch of sidewalk lined with parked cars. That's when he saw them. Ahead, standing near a lamp post, were 2 men who hadn't been there moments before. One was pretending to check his phone, his eyes flicking up too often. The other had his hands in his pockets, shifting slightly as if preparing to move. At the far end of the street, a black SUV idled with its engine running, its headlights off. The moment Chuck had turned the corner, it had inched forward, cutting off the most direct path away from the casino. He kept walking, his pace steady. He didn't need to turn around to know there were more behind him. The way the foot traffic had suddenly dispersed, the way conversations hushed in the background. It was all orchestrated. Imperium didn't want a scene. They wanted control. Chuck reached a small side alley between 2 buildings and stopped just before stepping into it. He exhaled slowly, then turned. The men behind him had closed the distance. 3 of them. Clean-cut, athletic, wearing casual suits that were tailored just enough to allow for movement. They weren't just security. These were professionals. Trained, calculated, and they weren't here to talk. One of them stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Chuck had already seen how this would play out. If he went with them, they would lead him somewhere private, somewhere away from cameras and witnesses. They would take his money. Maybe rough him up enough to make sure he didn't come back. They didn't know who they were dealing with. He took one last step forward, just enough to make them think he was complying. Then he moved. His right hand shot out, grabbing the closest man's wrist before he could react. A sharp twist sent a jolt of pain up the man's arm, and before he could even cry out, Chuck pivoted, using the man's own momentum to drive him forward, slamming him into the wall of the alley. The others reacted instantly. The second man lunged, but Chuck was already moving. He shifted his weight, sidestepping the attack with precision, catching the man's arm mid-motion. A controlled wrench sent him stumbling forward, off balance. Chuck followed through with a quick, brutal strike to the solar plexus. The man gasped, folding over himself as the air left his lungs. The third man hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Chuck turned his attention to him, reading his stance, his hesitance. He was the cautious one, the thinker. He wasn't going to charge in recklessly like the others. He reached inside his jacket. Chuck acted before he could draw whatever weapon he was going for. A single step closed the distance, and Chuck's fist connected with his wrist, sending a small knife clattering to the pavement. The man tried to pull back, but Chuck caught him by the lapel, twisting his own body to send him spinning. The man barely had time to register what had happened before he hit the pavement hard. The first attacker had recovered, but Chuck sensed him before he even moved. The sound of shifting feet, the quick intake of breath before a strike. It was all he needed. He ducked just as the man swung, catching only air. Chuck came up fast, an elbow driving into his jaw with enough force to snap his head back. The SUV at the end of the street suddenly revved its engine. Chuck looked up just in time to see the driver roll down his window. Another man inside, wearing a headset, spoke into a mic. Reinforcements. They weren't finished with him yet. Chuck exhaled, shaking the tension from his shoulders. He had warned them once. He had given them a chance. They didn't take it. The SUV's door swung open, and another man stepped out, bigger than the others. A different caliber. This wasn't just another casino thug. This was someone they had brought in specifically for him. The man rolled his shoulders, his expression calm. He didn't rush in like the others. He knew better. He took measured steps forward, sizing Chuck up. The street had emptied. The fight hadn't gone unnoticed, but no one wanted to get involved. Vegas had a way of turning a blind eye to things that didn't concern it. Chuck shifted his stance. This one wouldn't go down as easily. The big man made the first move, a feint to test Chuck's reflexes. Chuck didn't take the bait. He waited, watching. Then the real attack came. Fast, precise, controlled. The man wasn't just strong, he knew how to fight. He aimed low, trying to force Chuck onto the defensive. A sharp jab to the ribs, a quick attempt to hook his arm and take control of his center of gravity. Chuck countered effortlessly, knocking the man's arm aside before it could trap him. He stepped inside the attack, using the man's own momentum against him. A strike to the sternum sent the man stumbling back a step, but he recovered too quickly. The next exchange was brutal. Fists, elbows, feints, counters. Chuck absorbed a blow to his side but delivered one in return with twice the force. The man staggered, his composure breaking. Chuck didn't let him recover. He moved in, a sharp knee to the stomach doubling him over. The man went down. The fight was over. The others had seen enough. Chuck looked up, meeting the gaze of the man in the SUV. The driver hesitated, then put the car in reverse. The vehicle backed away slowly, disappearing into the city. Chuck exhaled. The men on the ground groaned, some struggling to rise, others too dazed to try. He looked at them for a moment, then turned and walked away. The night hadn't changed. Vegas was still buzzing, the casinos still pulsing with life, but Imperium Casino had made a mistake. They thought they could control him. They thought they could take what was his. They were wrong, and now they had his full attention. Las Vegas never truly slept. The lights never dimmed, the crowds never dispersed, and the streets never emptied. It was a city designed to consume, to keep people inside its orbit, feeding them dreams as long as they had something left to give. But beneath the glitz and spectacle, it was a city built on control. Every casino, every club, every high-roller lounge operated under an invisible hand, one that ensured the money always flowed in the right direction. And right now, Chuck Norris had disrupted that flow. The fight outside the Imperium Casino had been quick and brutal, but it was only the beginning. He had seen the look in the eyes of the men who remained standing, the hesitation before they backed off. They weren't retreating because they had given up. They were retreating because they were recalculating, because they weren't done. Chuck walked at a steady pace, his mind already working through the next steps. The city around him carried on as if nothing had happened. Tourists stumbled out of clubs, laughing and oblivious. Cabs zipped down the boulevard, picking up hopeful gamblers and dropping off the defeated. The music from the nearby strip clubs pulsed through the air, blending with the sounds of rolling dice and spinning roulette wheels. No one paid attention to him. No one paid attention to the men who followed. He had picked up the tale almost immediately. A dark sedan idling at the curb as he crossed the street. The flicker of movement in a side alley as he passed. They weren't closing in yet. They weren't rushing him. They had learned their lesson about direct confrontation. This was something else. They were watching. Waiting. Chuck adjusted his stride, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. He wasn't running, wasn't trying to lose them just yet. He wanted to see how far they were willing to go. He took a left onto a narrower street, away from the main strip, where the noise wasn't as deafening, where the lights weren't as blinding. The traffic here was thinner, the buildings older. A few low-rent motels, a couple of convenience stores, a pawn shop with metal bars on the windows. This was the Vegas people didn't put on postcards. He stopped at a crosswalk, pretending to check his phone. The sedan had followed, slowing down just enough to stay within range. A second car had joined now, another black SUV parked further up the street. They were boxing him in, making sure he had nowhere to go but where they wanted him. He crossed the street anyway. The sedan hesitated for a moment, then turned the corner, keeping him in sight. The SUV didn't move. They were patient. They were professionals. And that told Chuck everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about taking back his winnings. That had been the first mistake, the first misunderstanding. But now it had turned into something else. Now it was about sending a message. About making sure no one else got the wrong idea. About making sure no one thought they could walk into Imperium, beat the odds, and leave with their pockets full. Chuck had no intention of letting them send that message. He walked past the convenience store, stepping into the glow of a flickering street lamp. Ahead, the sidewalk curved around a small parking lot. mostly empty except for a couple of rusted-out sedans, the perfect spot for an ambush. They wanted him to keep walking, to step just far enough out of sight. Instead, he stopped. The sedan slowed. The SUV's driver's side door opened. Chuck turned to face them. For a moment, there was only silence. The hum of electricity from the streetlights, the distant wail of a siren somewhere deeper in the city. Then, the men stepped out. 4 of them this time. Different from the ones outside the casino. Bigger, more disciplined. Not casino security, not street-level enforcers. These were specialists. The lead man was built like a heavyweight boxer, thick shoulders stretching the seams of his suit jacket. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Didn't try to play the game of veiled threats and polite warnings. Chuck already knew why they were here. The first move came from the left, a quick, measured strike from the nearest attacker, testing him. Chuck dodged, shifting his weight effortlessly, letting the punch sail past his jaw by mere inches. He countered before the man could reset, a short, precise jab to the ribs, followed by a sweeping kick that sent him sprawling. The second man was faster, lunging with a blade in his hand. Chuck caught his wrist mid-motion, twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the pavement as the man let out a sharp grunt of pain. Chuck didn't stop. A knee to the stomach sent him crumpling, gasping for air. The third was a smart one. He didn't rush in blindly. He circled, waiting for an opening, calculating. Chuck watched him, keeping his movements fluid, controlled. The man feinted left, then right, before finally committing to a full-force strike. Chuck sidestepped at the last second, catching the man's arm and using his own momentum against him. A quick pivot, a solid twist, and the attacker found himself airborne before crashing hard onto the concrete. The last man hesitated. He had seen enough. Chuck straightened, adjusting his stance, ready. But the fourth man didn't engage. Instead, he took a step back, reaching into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a phone. Chuck knew what that meant. They weren't just testing him anymore. They were calling it in. This wasn't over. The SUV's engine roared back to life, headlights flooding the street. The last man turned, slipping inside, leaving the others where they had fallen. The sedan followed suit, its tires screeching as it sped off. Chuck exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He looked down at the men groaning on the pavement, some trying to crawl away, others too stunned to move. He could have pressed for answers, could have demanded to know who had sent them, but he already knew. Imperium wasn't backing down. And now, neither was he. He walked away, slipping back into the shadows of the city, disappearing into the night. But he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was preparing. Because if Imperium wanted to play this game, they had no idea what they had just started. Chuck Norris moved through the city like a shadow, blending into the flow of people with practiced ease. He wasn't running, wasn't hiding, but he wasn't making it easy for Imperium's men to track him either. The pursuit earlier had been calculated, organized. They weren't thugs reacting in the heat of the moment. They were professionals working under orders. That meant they had a structure, a chain of command. It also meant they were predictable. They expected him to flee, to disappear, to be on the defensive. That was their mistake. He crossed onto a quieter street, letting the rhythm of the city settle around him. The neon glow faded slightly as he moved away from the strip, past the endless casinos and nightclubs, past the tourists and gamblers. He needed to take control of the situation, and that meant striking first. If he let Imperium dictate the terms, they'd keep sending men after him, tightening the noose until they got what they wanted. That wasn't going to happen. The first step was figuring out who was running the show. Imperium was big, but no organization this ruthless operated without a face, without someone pulling the strings. Chuck didn't know the name yet, but he had a lead. The enforcers who had tailed him weren't just casino security. They weren't even just muscle. The last group had been specialists, trained men who knew how to operate in the shadows. They worked for someone higher up, someone who had decided he was a problem. And if Imperium was protecting something, then there had to be a central point of control, a place where the orders were given. That meant security. That meant surveillance. That meant the casino's private offices. He made his way toward a side street, ducking into an alley behind a row of shops. He knew better than to walk straight back into the lion's den. If they had learned anything from their failed attempts, they would be watching the entrances, waiting for him to try something reckless. But casinos weren't fortresses. They had weak points like any other business. And Chuck knew exactly where to find one. A service entrance tucked behind the building, nearly hidden in the shadows. A single metal door with a keypad used for deliveries and maintenance staff. There was no visible camera, but Chuck knew better. He glanced up, spotting the small recessed lens built into the overhang. He had to move fast. He walked up to the door, calm and deliberate, and knocked once. Then again. He waited. A moment later, the lock clicked from the inside. The door creaked open slightly, and a young man in a janitor's uniform peeked out. Chuck moved before the man could react, stepping inside and pressing him gently but firmly against the wall. He wasn't here to hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. "Sorry, kid," he said simply, taking the man's ID badge from his lanyard. The janitor didn't fight. He just nodded, wide-eyed, as Chuck stepped past him and closed the door behind him. Now he was in. The hallway was narrow, lined with unmarked doors leading to storage rooms and employee-only sections. Casinos weren't designed to make their back rooms inviting. They wanted people on the floor, spending money, not wondering what went on behind the scenes. Chuck moved quickly, following the layout in his head. He had seen enough of these places to know how they were structured. The main security offices wouldn't be on the lower floors, too accessible. They would be higher up, past restricted areas where only trusted personnel were allowed. He took a flight of stairs, 2 steps at a time, listening for movement. The deeper he went, the fewer distractions there were. The noise of the casino floor faded into the distance, replaced by the sterile quiet of business operations. He passed a few employees, technicians, security guards moving in pairs, but the ID badge kept them from questioning him. Then he found what he was looking for. A heavy, reinforced door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." Beyond it was the heart of Imperium's operations: surveillance, security feeds, the nerve center that kept the house in control. The problem was, it required a key card. Chuck glanced down at the badge he had taken. It wasn't enough. This was high-level access. He needed a different approach. A man in a navy blue security uniform rounded the corner, heading toward the door. Chuck didn't hesitate. As the man reached for his key card, Chuck stepped up beside him, moving as if he belonged there. The moment the guard swiped his card, Chuck grabbed his wrist, twisting sharply, forcing the man forward. A quick strike to the side of the neck sent him crumpling silently to the ground. Chuck caught him before he hit, easing him down. Then he took his key card. He swiped the card, and the door clicked open. Inside was a long corridor lined with monitors. Live feeds from the casino floor flickered across the screens, each one displaying a different angle. Poker tables, blackjack dealers, entrances, exits. A handful of men sat at desks, focused on their stations, watching for signs of trouble. None of them noticed him. Chuck moved silently, scanning the room. Then he saw what he was looking for: a separate office, enclosed in glass, its door slightly ajar. Inside, a man in a suit stood with his back turned, speaking into a phone. Chuck stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The man turned. He was older, well-dressed, exuding the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. He looked at Chuck, eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't panic. He had expected something like this. "You're persistent," the man said. Chuck didn't respond. The man exhaled, setting his phone down. "You could have just walked away." Chuck took a slow step forward. "You should know how this works," the man continued. "No one takes from Imperium. The house always wins." Chuck didn't move. He had no interest in threats, no patience for intimidation. The man sighed. "All right. Let's see what you really want." He reached for something inside his desk drawer. Chuck was faster. Before the man could pull whatever it was, Chuck grabbed his wrist, slamming it against the desk. A gun clattered to the floor. The man winced, his composure breaking for the first time. Chuck leaned in slightly. "You sent them after me." The man swallowed hard. Chuck tightened his grip. "Who do you work for?" The man hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Victor Hale." That was a name, the one at the top. Chuck released him, stepping back. The man rubbed his wrist, glaring. "You think you're untouchable?" the man asked, his voice edged with defiance. Chuck didn't answer. He turned, walking to the nearest monitor. He pressed a button. The casino's security feeds flickered, then rewound. Footage of his attack outside the casino played back in real time. The man's face paled. Chuck let it sink in, then he turned and walked out. The message was clear. This wasn't over. But now, the fight wasn't just about his winnings. Now, it was about taking the whole system down. Chuck Norris moved through the streets of Las Vegas with a steady, measured pace. The city pulsed around him, indifferent to the battles being fought in its shadows. Imperium Casino had overplayed its hand, and now it was time for him to play his. He had the name: Victor Hale. A man whose reach extended far beyond the neon-lit floors of his casino. A man who thrived in the darkness behind the flashing lights, pulling strings that most people never even realized existed. The confrontation in the surveillance room had told Chuck everything he needed to know. The casino wasn't just an establishment for gambling. It was a machine designed to siphon money, power, and control. It wasn't about luck or skill. It was about dominance. Players never truly won. The house always found a way to take it back. And for those who resisted, those who thought they could defy the system, there were people like the enforcers Imperium had sent after him. Victor Hale had built an empire on that principle. But now, that empire had a problem. Chuck didn't need to look over his shoulder to know he was still being watched. Even after he had dismantled their ambush, even after he had infiltrated their security office, Imperium wasn't done with him. They were regrouping, recalibrating. They weren't trying to stop him on the streets anymore. They were waiting for him to make his next move. They didn't have to wait long. Chuck made his way back toward the casino, his posture relaxed but his focus razor-sharp. The entrance loomed ahead, its golden-lit doors a gateway back into the heart of the beast. The same guards stood at their posts, their expressions neutral, their eyes betraying nothing. They didn't stop him. They didn't even react. But Chuck knew better. Word had already reached them. Inside, the casino floor buzzed with the same artificial energy, the same carefully curated chaos. Dealers shuffled cards, roulette wheels spun, and slot machines rang their hollow promises. To the average guest, nothing was amiss. But Chuck saw the differences. The pit bosses were more alert, their eyes subtly sweeping the room. Security personnel moved with an extra layer of purpose, strategically positioning themselves at key points. The cocktail waitresses who had glided effortlessly between tables earlier now moved with tension in their steps, their smiles more forced. The casino knew he was back. And it was ready. Chuck didn't break stride as he walked across the floor. The players at the high-stakes tables glanced up as he passed, their curiosity momentary before they returned to their own battles with chance. He wasn't here for the games anymore. He was here for Victor Hale. He spotted the access point near the back of the casino. A hallway marked VIP and executive offices. It was flanked by 2 guards who were far too disciplined to be regular casino security. These were different from the ones he had dealt with before. They weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to prevent. Chuck approached them without hesitation. He didn't slow down, didn't give them the chance to block his path before he was already there. One of them shifted slightly, his stance widening, his hand resting just near his belt, not quite reaching for a weapon, but close enough. Chuck stopped just a few feet away. The guard didn't speak. Neither did Chuck. Then, with no warning, Chuck moved. His right hand shot forward, gripping the nearest guard's wrist before he could react. A sharp twist forced the arm into a lock, and before the second guard could respond, Chuck delivered a precise strike to the first man's ribs. The air rushed out of his lungs, his body folded involuntarily. The second guard went for his gun. Chuck was faster. He stepped in, deflecting the draw with a controlled strike to the man's forearm, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. A follow-up elbow to the jaw sent him reeling. The first guard, struggling to recover, barely had time to react before Chuck pivoted, slamming his palm into the side of his head. He collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. The second man stumbled back, dazed. Chuck didn't give him time to regroup. He grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him forward before driving a knee into his abdomen. The guard gasped, his strength leaving him as he crumpled. Chuck stepped over them and pushed open the door. The hallway beyond was quieter, lined with closed doors. No flashing lights, no sounds of dice rolling, just the low hum of power humming behind locked offices. At the far end, a set of frosted glass doors stood slightly ajar. Victor Hale's office. Chuck walked forward, his steps echoing in the silence. Inside, Victor Hale sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his suit pristine, his expression unreadable. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside him, the amber liquid motionless. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the neon sprawl of Las Vegas. Victor didn't look surprised to see him. He leaned back slightly, studying Chuck with calm calculation. Chuck didn't stop walking until he was standing directly across from him. Victor exhaled slowly, reaching for his whiskey. He swirled the glass, but didn't drink. "You made quite a mess downstairs," Victor finally said. His voice was smooth, measured. Chuck didn't respond. Victor smiled faintly, setting the glass down. "You don't talk much, do you?" Chuck didn't move. Victor's smile faded slightly. "You should understand something," he continued. "This place, this city, it runs on rules. The kind of rules that don't bend for people like you. You should have taken your money and walked away. But now, you've made it personal." Chuck's expression remained unreadable. Victor leaned forward slightly. "So, tell me, what exactly do you want?" Chuck finally spoke. And the remaining operators scrambled, shouting into radios, trying to coordinate a response. Chuck didn't wait. He moved. The first security team arrived within seconds, storming through the entrance, weapons raised. Chuck ducked behind a console as the first shot shattered the monitor beside him. They weren't taking chances anymore. They weren't trying to subdue him. They were trying to eliminate him. He grabbed a nearby office chair and hurled it across the room. It crashed into the lead gunman, sending him staggering. Chuck followed, closing the distance before they could reset. A swift kick sent one man sprawling. A precise strike to another's wrist forced him to drop his weapon. The others hesitated, just long enough for Chuck to take control. He fought with the same efficiency he always did, no wasted movement. Every strike calculated, every step precise. The guards were trained, but they weren't him. Within moments, the room was silent again, bodies motionless on the floor. The alarm still blared. More would be coming. Chuck needed to move. He exited the surveillance room, taking a side route through the maintenance corridors. The casino's main floor was a no-go. Too many guards, too many eyes. He needed an alternate exit. He reached a service elevator and pressed the button. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car. He stepped inside and pressed the rooftop level. The elevator ascended, the numbers flickering past. He knew this wasn't over. Victor Hale wouldn't let him walk away so easily. He had backed him into a corner, and cornered men were dangerous. The doors opened onto the rooftop. The city stretched out below him, lights glittering against the dark desert sky. He moved quickly, scanning for a way down. A metal staircase ran along the side of the building, leading to an adjacent rooftop. He made his way across, his steps sure, his mind already focused on the next phase. The footage was safe, but the real battle was still ahead. Victor Hale wasn't just going to accept defeat. He was going to retaliate. Chuck welcomed it, because now the fight wasn't just about him. Now it was about justice. The night air was thick with the scent of asphalt and distant neon. From the rooftop, Chuck Norris had a clear view of the city below. Las Vegas pulsed, unaware of the war brewing above its flashing lights. He moved quickly, keeping low, his mind already calculating the next steps. The stolen footage was secured, tucked safely in his jacket. He had what he needed to bring Victor Hale's empire crumbling down. But Hale wasn't the kind of man to let that happen without a fight. Chuck reached the edge of the rooftop and scanned the adjacent buildings. He spotted a lower platform across a narrow alley, a maintenance structure that provided a perfect landing point. Without hesitation, he took 3 steps back, inhaled sharply, then sprinted forward. His legs coiled, his muscles flexed, and he launched himself across the gap. The wind howled around him for a split second before his boots landed solidly on the gravel-coated rooftop. He rolled with the impact, absorbing the force before springing back onto his feet. He didn't stop. The casino's alarm was still echoing through the night, and he knew the security teams were already moving. Hale wouldn't leave anything to chance, not after the damage Chuck had done. As if on cue, the rooftop access door on the Imperium building slammed open. A group of men spilled out, moving with coordinated precision. These weren't ordinary security. Their movements were too controlled, their spacing too exact. These were Hale's best. They spotted him immediately. One of them barked an order into a radio, but Chuck didn't wait for them to mobilize. He sprinted along the rooftop, weaving between air conditioning units and vent stacks, keeping himself a moving target. The first shot cracked through the night, striking a metal pipe just inches from his shoulder. They weren't holding back anymore. Chuck dropped low, using the cover to his advantage. He needed to close the distance before they could pin him down. He heard the scrape of boots behind him, the rush of men repositioning. A second shot rang out, this one closer. He moved. Exploding from his crouch, he darted left, cutting toward the stairwell that led down the side of the adjacent building. The gunmen reacted, shifting their fire, but Chuck was already gone. He hit the stairs hard, his boots clanging against the metal as he descended. Below, the city loomed, bright and indifferent. A few levels down, he spotted an open window, an entry point into the abandoned office space of a neighboring hotel. Chuck didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the railing, twisting midair to angle himself. His hands caught the edge of the window frame, and, with a powerful swing, he pulled himself inside. His feet hit the dusty carpet just as the first gunman reached the stairwell above. Chuck moved deeper into the building, navigating the darkened corridors. It was old, long since gutted for renovations that never came, perfect for losing his pursuers. He stayed low, listening. The gunmen weren't far. They were sweeping the area, methodical and patient. Chuck took a slow breath, centering himself. Then, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment, he struck. He moved fast, catching the nearest gunman from behind. One precise strike to the throat silenced him before he could shout. Chuck grabbed his weapon, a silenced pistol, and tucked it into his waistband. The others were close, unaware of their missing teammate. Chuck used the darkness, the silence. Another swift ambush, another man down. Then he heard it. A voice in the distance, calm, measured. Victor Hale. Chuck followed the sound, weaving through the skeletal remains of the building. He reached an open section of the floor, where a group of men had gathered. At the center stood Hale, his pristine suit untouched by the chaos, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't running. He was waiting. Chuck stepped into the light. The gunmen tensed, raising their weapons, but Hale held up a hand. They froze. "Impressive," Hale said, his voice smooth. "I thought they were exaggerating about you." Chuck didn't respond. Hale exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't realize what you've done, do you? You think you're tearing down a corrupt casino. But this is bigger than that. Imperium is a part of something far greater. A network. You think you can stop it?" Chuck took another step forward. Hale sighed. "You're not walking out of here, you know that, right?" Chuck didn't break stride. The moment snapped. The gunmen moved, raising their weapons. Chuck acted faster. He grabbed the silenced pistol from his waistband, firing twice. The first shot took out the nearest enforcer. The second struck another in the leg. The rest hesitated. Just long enough. Chuck charged. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of movement and precision. Chuck weaved between them, his fists and feet landing with devastating force. Bones cracked, bodies collapsed. They outnumbered him, but he outmatched them. One by one, they fell. Hale watched, his expression unreadable. When the last of his men hit the floor, he finally moved. He reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. Chuck was faster. He closed the distance before Hale could fire, twisting his wrist and wrenching the weapon away. It clattered to the floor. Hale staggered back, breathing hard, his confidence finally cracking. Chuck grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "You don't get to hide behind money anymore," Chuck said. Hale sneered. "You think this changes anything?" Chuck tightened his grip. Yes. He pulled the stolen drive from his pocket and held it up. "The world is about to see exactly what you are." Hale's smirk faltered. Chuck let him go, stepping back. Hale straightened his suit, trying to regain some dignity. "And what? You think you're a hero?" Chuck met his gaze. "No, just a man who doesn't lose." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Sirens echoed in the distance. Justice was coming, and for once, the house wasn't going to win. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch more videos for even more action, and share this one with others who would love it.